In the shadows of American history lies a chilling story. Many have never heard the rise of the Black Legion. This secretive group operated in the 1920s and 1930s, spreading fear and hatred across the Midwest, far from the public eye. Unlike other white supremacist organizations of the time, the Black Legion did not parade through the streets or hold large rallies. Instead, they worked silently and invisibly, weaving themselves into communities, government offices, and law enforcement, all while committing acts of violence that left communities trembling in fear. Imagine a world where trusted figures, police officers, judges, politicians, and business leaders were not protectors of justice, but instead part of a hidden network bent on terrorizing anyone who dared to challenge their vision of America. Their targets were clear: Black Americans striving for equality, immigrants seeking a better life, labor activists fighting for fair treatment, and anyone who stood against their hateful ideology. They operated under the guise of patriotism, but their actions betrayed a darker, more dangerous reality. The Black Legion was more than just a hate group. It was a well-organized and militarized force that thrived in a time of economic hardship and social unrest. The Great Depression left many white working-class men fearful of losing their jobs and status, and the Black Legion exploited these anxieties to grow its ranks. Initiation rituals bound members with oaths of secrecy and loyalty, ensuring the organization's power remained hidden in plain sight. Today, we are going to uncover the secrets behind the Black Legion, who they were, how they operated, and the impact they had on communities across America. This is a story of darkness, but also one of resilience, as those who stood against them fought back to bring their terror into the light. If you are passionate about learning untold histories and shining a light on stories that need to be heard, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an important chapter of history that could change the way you see the world. Join us as we unmask the Black Legion and explore the hidden forces that shaped America's past. Unlike the Ku Klux Klan, whose terrifying presence was often marked by blazing crosses and public marches, the Black Legion chose a much darker, more secretive path, operating entirely in the shadows where their terror could spread unnoticed yet deeply felt. They did not seek the spotlight, nor did they rely on grand displays to make their presence known. Instead, they donned black hooded robes, their faces hidden behind eerie masks, and moved silently through the night like ghosts intent on sowing fear and control without drawing the attention of the wider public. Their actions were calculated to evade the law and public scrutiny, making them far more insidious and difficult to combat. This cloak of secrecy allowed the Black Legion to infiltrate every layer of society. By day, many of their members were ordinary men, police officers who should have been protectors of the community, judges entrusted with upholding justice, politicians elected to serve the people, and businessmen wielding economic influence. But once night fell, these same individuals transformed into agents of intimidation and violence, enforcing a brutal ideology that demanded absolute loyalty and silence. Their ability to blend into the fabric of everyday life meant their victims often had nowhere to turn. The very systems designed to protect them were compromised by those who wore the Legion's black robes. The Black Legion's preference for covert operations was not just a tactical choice, but a reflection of their sophisticated understanding of power and fear. Public displays like rallies and marches, while attention-grabbing, also invited backlash, legal scrutiny, and public condemnation. By operating in secrecy, the Legion could commit acts that terrorized communities without immediate reprisal, creating a pervasive climate of dread that lingered long after their shadows disappeared. Families lived with the haunting knowledge that any knock on the door late at night could mean abduction, brutal beating, or worse. Yet they dared not speak out, and knowing that their neighbors, officials, and even law enforcement could be part of the conspiracy. This secrecy extended to their rituals and oaths, binding members in a code of silence that was enforced with lethal seriousness. Recruits were sworn in under threat of death, taking an oath that promised complete devotion to the Legion's cause. The black robes and hoods became not just a disguise, but a symbol of unwavering commitment, a visual reminder that the wearer belonged to a brotherhood that demanded absolute obedience and punished betrayal with the harshest consequences. In this way, the Black Legion built a network of fear and complicity, where the risks of dissent kept members bound together and the outside world oblivious. What set the Black Legion apart from other extremist groups was precisely this level of organization and infiltration. While the Kiki's presence was often seen and documented, allowing for some measure of public resistance, the Black Legion's invisible grip tightened quietly but firmly across towns and cities. They strategically recruited disillusioned white working-class men, many of whom were struggling with the economic despair of the Great Depression and fearful of losing their livelihoods. To black workers, immigrants, or union activists exploiting these anxieties, the Legion promised protection, purpose, and a sense of belonging, elements that appealed to men searching for control amid chaos. Once inside, members were quickly indoctrinated into the Legion's harsh reality. The fight was not just ideological but physical, demanding readiness to silence opposition through any means necessary. Their operations included kidnappings in the dead of night, secretive assaults, and the torching of homes and businesses belonging to those who challenged the status quo. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned campaigns designed to terrorize entire communities, suppress political activism, and maintain a social order built on racial and ethnic hatred. The silence surrounding these attacks was as deliberate as the attacks themselves, for revealing the perpetrators meant risking one's life. Communities under the Black Legion's shadow were gripped by a profound sense of vulnerability, with law enforcement and local officials often implicated as members or sympathizers. Victims found no refuge in the very institutions meant to safeguard their rights. Reports of violence were dismissed or ignored. Investigations were stonewalled, and in many cases, survivors and witnesses remained silent out of fear for their own safety. This insidious blending of terror and legitimacy ensured the Black Legion's reign could persist largely unchallenged for years. The power of the Black Legion's covert approach was ultimately its undoing. Their ability to hide behind the masks of respectability created a fragile balance that cracked when they made a fatal error targeting an individual whose disappearance could not be overlooked. This mistake triggered investigations that peeled back the layers of secrecy, revealing a vast and organized network of hatred that had been quietly poisoning communities across states. As evidence mounted and testimonies emerged, the true extent of the Black Legion's influence shocked a nation unprepared for the level of infiltration and brutality concealed behind their black robes. The story of the Black Legion is a haunting reminder that terror need not always be loud to be deadly. Sometimes, it thrives most dangerously in the silence between shadows, where fear is whispered rather than shouted, and power is exercised in the dark corners of society. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond the obvious, to question who holds power in our communities, and to understand that vigilance against hatred requires uncovering the invisible as much as confronting the visible. By unraveling the history of the Black Legion, we not only honor the victims who suffered in silence but also learn critical lessons about the dangers of secrecy, complicity, and the ways fear can be weaponized. It is a call to remember that the fight against hatred and injustice is ongoing, and that sometimes the greatest threats lurk not in the open, but hidden in plain sight. What made the Black Legion especially terrifying and effective was not just their secretive operations or ruthless tactics, but the fact that many of their members were people who society trusted the most: police officers, judges, politicians, and businessmen. These were the very individuals who, under normal circumstances, were expected to uphold law, order, and justice. Yet they chose instead to become agents of fear and oppression, blurring the lines between protector and predator. This infiltration into positions of authority allowed the Black Legion to operate with a disturbing level of impunity, making their reign of terror all the more insidious and difficult to confront. Imagine a small Midwestern town in the 1930s, where the local police chief is not just aware of the Black Legion's activities but actively involved, participating in secret meetings and enforcing the group's violent agenda by day while donning the black robes by night. Judges who were meant to impartially uphold the law found ways to dismiss or minimize charges against fellow Legion members, effectively shielding them from accountability. Politicians, many elected on platforms of patriotism, manipulated laws and policies to further the group's agenda, disenfranchising black citizens and immigrants, suppressing labor movements, and maintaining a social order that benefited the white supremacist vision they shared. This deep penetration into the institutions meant that victims had little recourse for justice. Complaints of violence, intimidation, or threats were often ignored or actively suppressed, and investigations frequently went nowhere because those in charge were complicit or even orchestrated the very acts of terror themselves. This created a suffocating environment where fear was compounded by betrayal, as the community's supposed guardians were in fact the architects of their suffering. Businessmen affiliated with the Black Legion wielded their influence in economic spheres, using their power to intimidate black entrepreneurs or union organizers who challenged the status quo. Successful black-owned businesses became targets for arson and sabotage, sending a clear message that economic progress for marginalized communities would not be tolerated. These attacks were not random acts of hate, but calculated moves designed to maintain economic control and reinforce systemic inequality. The network of the Black Legion extended like a shadowy web through towns and cities, with members supporting each other in maintaining secrecy and enforcing loyalty. This created a culture of silence where whistleblowers or those who might consider speaking out faced severe consequences. The oath sworn by members was more than just words. It was a binding contract that demanded absolute obedience, sealed by the threat of death or brutal retribution. This fostered an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust, where friends, neighbors, and colleagues could be allies or enemies, depending on their allegiance to the Legion. What is particularly chilling about this infiltration is how it allowed the Black Legion to disguise their true nature behind a facade of respectability and patriotism. Publicly, many members were pillars of their communities, attending church, running businesses, and participating in civic life. Yet behind closed doors, they orchestrated acts of terror meant to silence dissent and maintain a hierarchy based on fear and hatred. This dual existence made it incredibly difficult for outsiders to recognize the threat, as the face of the Black Legion was often the face of authority and respectability. This blend of power and secrecy created a near-perfect storm for the Black Legion's rise. Their members' positions allowed them to manipulate systems from within, making resistance dangerous and complex. When victims sought protection or justice, they often found the doors closed or faced hostility from those meant to protect them. This betrayal not only perpetuated violence but also fractured community trust, leaving scars that would last long after the group's downfall. The story of the Black Legion serves as a stark reminder of how extremism can take root not only in fringe groups, but within the very structures designed to protect society. Their infiltration of law enforcement, judiciary, government, and business illustrates the danger of unchecked power wielded in secrecy and prejudice. It challenges us to remain vigilant about who holds authority, and to recognize that justice cannot flourish where those entrusted to uphold it are compromised. Understanding the Black Legion's reach into influential roles helps explain why their terror went unchecked for so long. It also highlights the courage required by those who eventually stood against them, risking their lives to expose a system deeply corrupted by hate. Their story is a powerful lesson on the importance of transparency, accountability, and the need to confront uncomfortable truths in the pursuit of a just society. The legacy of the Black Legion's infiltration into positions of power is a cautionary tale that resonates far beyond its time. It reminds us that vigilance against hatred must include scrutiny of institutions and those who serve within them. Only by shining a light on hidden threats can communities protect themselves from the shadows of oppression. The Black Legion's mission was clear and brutally uncompromising. They targeted anyone who threatened their vision of a white supremacist America. Their victims were not limited to a single group, but spanned a broad spectrum of people who dared to challenge or disrupt the rigid social order they sought to impose. Black Americans striving for dignity and equality, immigrants chasing the promise of a better life, labor activists fighting for workers' rights, and anyone who stood against the tide of hatred and oppression became targets of relentless violence and intimidation. This widespread campaign of terror was meant not only to silence voices of resistance but to instill a deep, paralyzing fear in entire communities, ensuring that the Black Legion's influence would go unchallenged. During the turbulent years of the Great Depression, as economic hardships gripped the nation, racial tensions flared with unprecedented intensity. Unemployed and desperate white workers often viewed black laborers and immigrants as unwelcome competition for scarce jobs and resources. The Black Legion seized upon these fears, painting their targets as enemies undermining American values and prosperity. Through carefully crafted propaganda, they spread lies and stoked resentment, blaming social and economic woes on those they deemed outsiders or agitators. But behind the rhetoric lay a far more sinister reality. Systematic violence aimed at crushing hope and progress for marginalized groups. Black Americans, in particular, bore the brunt of the Legion's terror. Those who sought political power, organized for better working conditions, or simply lived their lives with dignity were constantly at risk. Reverend Turner, respected pastor in Indiana, became a symbol of this danger when he was ambushed and murdered by hooded figures for encouraging black residents to register to vote. His death sent shockwaves through the community, a grim reminder that even faith and peaceful activism could not protect against the Legion's wrath. Similarly, George March, a black auto worker in Detroit who courageously tried to unite black and white workers under one union, was abducted in the dead of night and found brutally murdered. These acts were not isolated but part of a relentless strategy to dismantle any form of empowerment. Immigrants, too, were marked for persecution. Many newcomers to the Midwest faced suspicion and hostility as they tried to build new lives. The Black Legion viewed immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and others as threats to their idealized vision of America and unleashed campaigns of harassment and violence against them. Homes were burned, businesses sabotaged, and families terrorized, all under the cover of darkness to avoid public detection. These attacks shattered the fragile sense of security immigrants had and reinforced a hostile environment that sought to keep them marginalized. Labor activists and union organizers were another prime target for the Black Legion's violence. In an era marked by labor strikes and calls for fair wages and working conditions, the Legion positioned itself as a defender of traditional power structures, using intimidation and brutality to suppress efforts that might empower the working class. Factories and workplaces became battlegrounds where the Legion's influence ensured that protests were crushed and union leaders silenced. The group's reach into police departments and local governments often meant that victims could not count on protection or justice, as authorities either looked the other way or actively participated in the suppression. The methods employed by the Black Legion to maintain their grip on power were both ruthless and chillingly efficient. They operated like a shadow army, striking swiftly and disappearing without trace. Kidnappings, beatings, and executions were carried out under the veil of night, leaving behind a climate of fear that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The group's ability to hide within communities, sometimes even among neighbors and local officials, made their attacks feel unpredictable and inescapable. Families lived with the terror that any act of defiance or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean a violent end. What made the Black Legion's campaign especially devastating was its psychological impact. The goal was not merely to punish individuals, but to break the spirit of entire communities, to silence voices of resistance before they could grow too loud. Black families who dared to move into white neighborhoods found their homes burned to the ground. Places of worship and community centers were bombed, and activists disappeared without explanation. These acts served as brutal warnings to anyone who might consider standing up against the entrenched system of racial hatred and economic inequality. The silence that surrounded these atrocities was deafening. Victims and witnesses often refrained from speaking out, fearing retaliation from a group that was deeply embedded in local power structures. When reports of violence reached the authorities, they were too frequently dismissed as personal disputes or random acts of crime rather than the orchestrated campaign they truly were. Even black newspapers that dared to expose the Black Legion faced violent attacks, with offices bombed or set on fire to prevent the truth from spreading. This systemic suppression of information allowed the Legion's reign to continue longer than it might have otherwise. Despite their ruthless tactics, the Black Legion's grip on terror ultimately began to unravel with the murder of Charles P., a crime so brazen and public that it forced law enforcement to act. This marked the beginning of a turning point, exposing the organization's deep-rooted presence and sparking a wave of arrests and trials. Survivors and former members began to share harrowing testimonies, shedding light on the extent of the Legion's operations and the communities they had terrorized. The story of the Black Legion's targeting of Black Americans, immigrants, labor activists, and dissenters is a stark reminder of the lengths to which hate groups will go to maintain power and control. Their violence was not random but a calculated effort to enforce a social order built on fear, exclusion, and brutality. It teaches us the importance of vigilance and courage in the face of oppression, and the need to remember the struggles of those who fought for justice in the darkest of times. Understanding this history helps us see how the forces of hatred and intolerance can manipulate economic anxieties and social fears to justify violence and discrimination. It challenges us to confront the legacies of such groups in today's society and to work toward a future where no one lives in fear because of their race, background, or beliefs. The Black Legion was far more than just a loosely organized hate group. It was a tightly controlled, militarized organization that demanded unwavering loyalty and absolute secrecy from its members, binding them together through fear, discipline, and a shared sense of purpose rooted in hatred. At the heart of their power was a strict military-style hierarchy that structured every aspect of their operations, creating a disciplined force that was as efficient as it was deadly. This hierarchy was not merely a system of ranks and titles, it was the backbone of an organization that depended on rigid control and ruthless enforcement to maintain its grip on power and silence dissent within its own ranks. Recruits were not simply welcomed with open arms. They were subjected to a harrowing initiation process designed to test their commitment and bind them irrevocably to the cause. The initiation involved swearing an oath of absolute loyalty, a solemn and terrifying promise made under the shadow of death. This oath was not a mere formality but a binding contract that placed the recruit's life and soul in the hands of the Legion. It was a vow to obey every command without question, to never betray the secrets of the organization, and to accept the ultimate penalty, death, if they ever turned against the group or revealed its workings. The weight of this oath created an atmosphere where silence was enforced by the threat of brutal reprisal, ensuring that fear kept the organization tightly sealed from outside scrutiny. The hierarchy itself was modeled after military organizations, with clear chains of command that divided the Legion into companies led by colonels and captains, down to lieutenants. sergeants, and foot soldiers who carried out the orders. Each unit had specialized roles. Some focused on recruitment and propaganda, while others specialized in intimidation, kidnapping, or worse. This division of labor made the Black Legion an incredibly effective and dangerous force. It was not a chaotic mob but a well-oiled machine with plans, strategies, and little precision. Members were expected to function as parts of a whole, where obedience and discipline were paramount, and any hint of weakness or disloyalty was swiftly and mercilessly dealt with. The initiation ceremony itself was a chilling experience. Recruits were blindfolded, taken to secluded locations, and surrounded by hooded men dressed in black robes with menacing symbols adorning their chests. As they knelt under the cold barrel of a revolver pressed to their backs, they were asked piercing questions designed to confirm their racial and ideological purity: native-born white Protestant, loyalty to the cause, willingness to die if necessary. The gravity of the moment was underscored by the presence of weapons and the solemnity of the oath, which called down curses upon any who might betray the Legion. The recruit was handed a bullet as a symbol of the deadly seriousness of their commitment, a reminder that betrayal was not just discouraged but punishable by dismemberment and eternal damnation. This ritual served multiple purposes: instilled fear, solidified loyalty, and created a bond between members that was as much psychological as it was ideological. It fostered a cult-like mentality where the organization's survival was paramount, and individual lives were expendable if it meant protecting the group. The black robes and hoods became more than disguises; they were symbols of identity, commitment, and shared secrecy that separated the Legion from the rest of society. The military-style discipline extended beyond initiation into everyday operations. The Legion conducted secret meetings, coordinated attacks, and maintained strict rules about communication and secrecy. Orders were given verbally to prevent any paper trail, and membership lists were destroyed regularly to erase evidence. Members were expected to report to their superiors without question and carry out violent acts when ordered, including intimidation, arson, kidnapping, and murder. This level of control and organization allowed the Black Legion to function like a covert paramilitary group, capable of swift, ruthless action while remaining hidden in plain sight. Such structure also created an internal culture of surveillance and mistrust, where members were constantly reminded that betrayal would bring death. This culture of fear was crucial to maintaining discipline and preventing leaks that could expose the group to law enforcement. Members knew that even a hint of disloyalty could result in brutal punishment, which kept them bound tightly to the organization's deadly mission. This psychological control was as important as the physical threat of violence in ensuring the Black Legion's secrecy and longevity. The leadership played a critical role in maintaining this system. Figures like Virgil Butterfinger, who reorganized the Legion into a hierarchical force, and enforcers like Dayton Dean, who later confessed to multiple killings, exemplified the ruthless command that drove the group. These leaders enforced discipline and orchestrated campaigns of terror with military precision, ensuring that every member understood their role and carried it out without hesitation. This strict military hierarchy and the oath of loyalty not only made the Black Legion incredibly effective in its violent campaign, but also deeply insidious. It transformed a group of individuals into a unified force bound by fear, ideology, and deadly commitment. The organization was not just a collection of violent men, but a disciplined army operating under a code that demanded secrecy, obedience, and ruthless enforcement. Understanding this aspect of the Black Legion is key to grasping how they managed to wield such power and terrorize communities for years without being dismantled sooner. Their structure made them resilient, their secrecy nearly impenetrable, and their violence systematic. It was a reminder that hate can be organized, disciplined, and methodical, not just chaotic and spontaneous. The oath and hierarchy ensured that members were not just willing participants but deeply committed soldiers in a brutal war against anyone who opposed their vision of America. This militarized discipline, while effective for the Black Legion's dark goals, also became their weakness. Their rigid structure and strict loyalty made them vulnerable when key members were arrested or turned informants, unraveling the carefully maintained secrecy. Ultimately, the very system that made them powerful became the means of their downfall, as confessions and testimonies exposed the Legion's operations and brought justice to those they had terrorized. The story of the Black Legion's military-style hierarchy and deadly oath is a chilling example of how extremist groups can organize and enforce their ideology with ruthless efficiency. It warns us of the dangers when hate is combined with discipline and secrecy, and it challenges us to remain vigilant against such forces in any form they take. In the depths of the Great Depression, as unemployment soared and economic desperation gripped countless families across America, the Black Legion found fertile ground for expanding its ranks. The organization targeted white working-class men who were struggling to make ends meet and felt their livelihoods threatened by the very people who were also fighting to survive black workers. These economic anxieties created a perfect storm, a sense of vulnerability and fear that the Legion skillfully exploited, twisting it into a weapon to recruit new members into their secretive and violent ranks. The promise of belonging, protection, and purpose offered by the Legion was a siren call to men who felt abandoned by society and desperate for control in uncertain times. These working-class men, many of whom had lost jobs or feared losing them, found themselves caught in a brutal competition for scarce opportunities. Factories, mills, and plants that once promised steady employment were now battlegrounds for survival. Black workers, migrating to northern cities in search of better opportunities, were often seen as direct competition for jobs and wages. The Black Legion capitalized on this tension by spreading propaganda that blamed black laborers for taking jobs away from white workers, portraying them as threats to economic security and American values. This narrative resonated deeply with those grappling with poverty and fear, making the Legion's hateful message dangerously persuasive. Recruitment efforts were strategic and relentless. Rather than relying on public rallies or grand displays, the Black Legion operated in shadows, approaching potential recruits quietly and personally. Often, a friend, relative, or mere acquaintance would invite a man to a private meeting under the guise of offering protection and support. These meetings usually took place at night, away from prying eyes, where recruits were gradually drawn into the fold through a mix of camaraderie, fear, and shared grievances. The sense of brotherhood and belonging filled a void for many men who felt isolated and powerless in a rapidly changing world. For them, the Legion was not just a group, but a lifeline and opportunity to reclaim status and control by aligning with a powerful and secretive force. Yet, this recruitment was not always voluntary. Pressure, intimidation, and threats were common tactics used to coerce men into swearing allegiance. Those who hesitated or refused were often subjected to beatings or worse, a harsh reminder that loyalty was demanded, not negotiated. The phrase "you are either with us or against us" echoed through recruitment circles, creating an atmosphere where dissent was met with brutal consequences. This coercive approach ensured a steady flow of members while cementing a culture of fear and obedience within the organization. The Black Legion's recruitment was also deeply intertwined with local power structures. Police officers, factory supervisors, and local politicians who were members or sympathizers played key roles in identifying and pressuring potential recruits. Their positions of authority allowed them to manipulate opportunities and suppress opposition, making the Legion's influence pervasive and difficult to resist. By embedding themselves within these institutions, the Legion created a support network that reinforced the message and ensured new members felt protected and empowered. for white working-class men grappling with uncertainty. The Black Legion's rhetoric offered a clear enemy and a simple solution. The organization painted a picture of a society under siege, where jobs, safety, and traditional values were at risk from outsiders, black workers, immigrants, labor activists, and anyone challenging the status quo. By positioning themselves as defenders of America, the Legion exploited fears of economic displacement and social change, channeling frustration into hate-fueled action. This framing provided recruits with a sense of purpose and identity at a time when many felt marginalized and forgotten. As the Legion grew, its members became enforcers of this ideology, tasked with suppressing labor movements, intimidating minority communities, and maintaining racial segregation by force. Their attacks were not random acts of violence, but calculated efforts to control economic and social dynamics in the communities they infiltrated. Black workers who sought better wages or union representation faced threats, kidnappings, and brutal assaults designed to discourage collective action and maintain white dominance in the workforce. The economic desperation of the era magnified the impact of the Black Legion's recruitment tactics. In towns and cities across the Midwest, where industrial jobs were both coveted and scarce, the Legion's message resonated with those who felt left behind by the promises of the American dream. The allure of belonging to a group that promised protection and influence, combined with the manipulative scapegoating of marginalized communities, created a potent mix that fueled the Legion's expansion. Their ability to tap into these deep-seated anxieties turned economic hardship into a breeding ground for hate and violence. The consequences of this recruitment strategy were devastating not only for those targeted by the Legion, but for the social fabric of entire communities. Fear and mistrust spread as the group's presence grew, dividing neighborhoods and workplaces along racial and ideological lines. The promise of economic security came at the cost of perpetuating systemic racism and injustice, reinforcing barriers that would take generations to dismantle. The Black Legion's exploitation of economic fears illustrates how hardship can be manipulated to serve dangerous agendas, turning legitimate concerns into tools of oppression. Reflecting on this history, it becomes clear how economic instability can be weaponized by extremist groups to recruit and radicalize individuals. The Black Legion's success in recruiting white working-class men during the Great Depression serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities that arise in times of crisis and the importance of addressing underlying social and economic inequalities. Understanding this aspect of their rise helps us recognize similar patterns in contemporary movements and underscores the need for vigilance, education, and inclusive solutions that address fears without resorting to hatred. The story of the Black Legion's recruitment tactics reminds us that the roots of hate often grow in the fertile soil of fear and uncertainty. By exploiting economic anxieties, the Legion not only expanded its membership, but also entrenched divisions that would have lasting effects on American society. It challenges us to confront the ways in which fear can be manipulated and to work toward building communities grounded in empathy, justice, and shared humanity rather than division and suspicion. In the shadows of America's heartland during the 1920s and 1930s, the Black Legion operated with a terrifying silence that masked the true horror of their actions. Unlike groups that sought public attention through grand displays, this organization chose the cover of night to carry out its brutal campaign of terror, striking swiftly and vanishing without a trace. Their methods were chillingly calculated. Kidnappings, beatings, murders, and arson became tools in their arsenal, employed not just to punish individuals, but to spread a pervasive fear that seeped into entire communities. The darkness was their ally, allowing them to instill dread without the spectacle, ensuring that their victims and those who might stand with them felt the invisible, but ever-present threat of violence. The Black Legion's attacks were marked by a ruthless efficiency that left little room for escape or justice. Families would awake to the terrifying sound of their doors being forced open, only to witness loved ones dragged into waiting vehicles by hooded figures cloaked in black robes. These kidnappings were not random acts of cruelty, but targeted operations aimed at silencing voices of resistance and terrorizing communities that dared to challenge white supremacy. Often, the victims were beaten mercilessly or left to disappear into the night, their fates sealed in shallow graves or forgotten corners. The psychological impact of these abductions rippled far beyond the immediate families, sending a stark warning to others. Defiance would come at a deadly cost. Beatings were another favored tactic, carried out with brutal force and deliberate cruelty. Men and women who dared to organize labor strikes, attend meetings advocating for civil rights, or simply assert their rights in hostile neighborhoods found themselves at the mercy of these violent enforcers. The wounds left behind were not only physical but symbolic, marks intended to break the spirit and discourage further acts of courage. In workplaces, homes, and streets, the threat of violence hung like a dark cloud, stifling efforts for change and perpetuating a climate of intimidation. Murder was the ultimate tool of the Black Legion's silent terror campaign. Victims were often taken from their homes or workplaces in the dead of night, their bodies discovered days or weeks later in unmarked graves or abandoned areas. These killings were calculated messages meant to eliminate key figures, activists, community leaders, and anyone whose influence threatened the Legion's vision. One such case was the abduction and murder of George March, a black auto worker who had sought to unite black and white workers under one union. His brutal death was a grim testament to the lengths the Legion would go to maintain racial and economic control. These acts of violence were not isolated but part of a broader pattern designed to silence opposition through terror. Arson, too, was a signature tactic of the Black Legion. Homes, businesses, churches, and community centers, especially those belonging to black families and activists, were set ablaze under cover of darkness. The fires consumed more than property. They destroyed safe spaces and symbols of hope, leaving communities in smoldering ruins and fear. The deliberate targeting of places where people gathered to support one another was meant to isolate victims further and reinforce the message that resistance would be met with devastating consequences. These nighttime infernos became a terrifying hallmark of the Legion's reign, a visible scar left behind in the wake of their invisible operations. What made these violent acts particularly insidious was the Legion's ability to blend seamlessly into everyday life. Members often held respected positions as police officers, judges, politicians, and businessmen, allowing them to carry out attacks while maintaining respectable public personas. This duality meant that victims often had nowhere to turn for protection or justice. The very authorities meant to uphold the law were complicit in perpetuating the terror. Reports of violence and intimidation were frequently dismissed or ignored, deepening the sense of helplessness and isolation among targeted communities. The secretive nature of these violent acts also meant that witnesses were scarce and survivors often too afraid to speak out. The Black Legion enforced a strict code of silence, punishing any hint of betrayal with swift and deadly consequences. This culture of fear ensured that the true extent of their atrocities remained hidden for years, allowing the organization to operate with near impunity. Families who lost loved ones were left to grieve in silence, their pain compounded by the absence of justice or acknowledgement. Despite the terror they spread, the Black Legion's violence was not chaotic or random but orchestrated with military precision. Orders were given through a strict chain of command, with operations carefully planned and executed to maximize impact while minimizing exposure. The use of the night for these attacks was strategic, allowing the group to strike fear into hearts without attracting unwanted attention. This covert approach made them especially difficult to track or dismantle, as they left behind few clues and no public scenes to investigate. This silent campaign of violence achieved its intended effect, instilling a deep and lasting fear that permeated communities and stifled resistance. The psychological warfare waged by the Black Legion created an environment where silence and compliance were often the only means of survival. The group's ability to maintain secrecy while delivering brutal punishment served as a powerful tool in upholding white supremacy and suppressing social and economic progress for marginalized groups. Yet, this darkness could not hide the truth forever. As investigations eventually unraveled the Black Legion's network, survivors and former members came forward with harrowing testimonies that revealed the full scope of the group's violent activities. These accounts brought the silent terror into the light, exposing the organized cruelty that had haunted communities for years. The story of their secretive, nocturnal violence serves as a haunting reminder of how hate, when combined with secrecy and ruthless discipline, can devastate lives and fracture societies. In remembering the Black Legion's campaign of clandestine violence, we confront a dark chapter of American history that underscores the power of fear as a weapon. Their use of kidnappings, beatings, murders, and arson, all carried out under the cover of night, demonstrates the lengths to which hate groups will go to control and intimidate. This history challenges us to remain vigilant against such forces, to support those who stand against oppression, and to ensure that the shadows where terror once thrived are never allowed to return. Among the countless victims of the Black Legion's terror, some names stand out, figures whose courage and leadership made them targets in a brutal campaign designed to silence progress and maintain white supremacy. George March and Reverend Turner were more than individuals. They embodied hope, unity, and resistance within their communities. And their tragic fates reveal the ruthless extent of the Black Legion's violent reach. Their stories weave into the larger narrative of a secret organization that wielded fear like a weapon, seeking to extinguish any light of change or justice. George March was a black auto worker in Detroit during a time when the industrial North promised opportunities, but also harbored deep racial tensions. As the Great Depression ravaged the country, George saw the struggle not just as an economic battle but as a fight for equality and solidarity. He sought to bridge divides by organizing both black and white workers into a single union, believing that unity was the key to overcoming exploitation and discrimination. His efforts were revolutionary for the time and place, threatening the established order that relied on division to keep certain groups powerless. This made George a marked man in the eyes of the Black Legion, who viewed such unity as a dangerous challenge to their vision of a segregated and controlled society. One chilling night in 1935, George March's resolve was met with unthinkable violence. 6 men, hooded and masked, stormed into his home, dragging him away as his wife and children watched in horror. The Black Legion's brutality was on full display. His bound body was later found in a shallow grave outside the city, his skull fractured and hands tied with barbed wire. This was not merely an act of cruelty, but a calculated message meant to terrorize anyone who dared to fight for justice or equality. George March's murder was a stark reminder of the deadly stakes faced by those who stood up against hate and oppression. Similarly, Reverend Turner was a respected black pastor in Indiana whose voice echoed through his community as a beacon of hope and empowerment. In 1934, as racial violence escalated and communities struggled to assert their rights, Turner took on the role of political organizer, encouraging black residents to register to vote and participate in local elections. He understood that political power was essential to combating the growing tide of racial terror and systemic discrimination. His activism was a direct threat to the Black Legion's goal of maintaining white dominance, and he quickly became a target for their wrath. One evening, as Reverend Turner left his church, he was ambushed by hooded figures lurking in the shadows. Witnesses heard the sharp reports of gunfire followed by the speeding of a getaway car. Turner's body was found days later in a nearby neighborhood, the violence of his death a grim punctuation to his courageous efforts. His assassination sent shockwaves through the community, underscoring the dangerous reality for black leaders who dared to speak out or organize in pursuit of justice. Reverend Turner's fate was a brutal reminder that leadership in the face of hate often came with mortal risk. These targeted killings of community leaders like March and Turner were part of a broader pattern aimed at dismantling any structures of resistance within black communities and beyond. The Black Legion was not interested in random violence. Their attacks were carefully planned to decapitate movements, disrupt organizing efforts, and instill a deep-seated fear that kept others from rising. By removing prominent figures, they sought to weaken the social fabric and maintain control through intimidation. The impact of these murders reached far beyond the immediate loss of life. Families were shattered, communities traumatized, and a chilling silence fell over those who witnessed or heard of these acts. The violence was a powerful deterrent, sending a clear message that any challenge to the Legion's authority or white supremacy would be met with deadly force. Yet, despite the fear and loss, the legacies of George March and Reverend Turner endured, inspiring future generations to continue the fight for equality and justice. Their stories highlight the human cost behind the statistics and headlines, reminding us that history is shaped by individuals whose courage can either illuminate or be extinguished by the forces of oppression. George March and Reverend Turner represent the resilience of a community determined to survive and thrive in the face of organized terror. Their leadership challenged not just the Black Legion, but the entire system that allowed such hatred to flourish in the shadows. The targeting of these leaders also exposes the insidious nature of the Black Legion's strategy. By infiltrating institutions and blending into society, members of the Legion ensured that attacks could be carried out with impunity, and that victims had little recourse to justice. The complicity of law enforcement and local governments in ignoring or even facilitating this violence further deepened the wounds inflicted on these communities. This systemic failure allowed the Black Legion to operate unchecked for years, perpetuating cycles of fear and oppression. Despite this, the bravery of those like March and Turner serves as a testament to the enduring spirit of resistance. Their willingness to stand up, organize, and lead in such dangerous times challenges us to reflect on the importance of leadership, solidarity, and courage in the ongoing struggle against hate and injustice. Their lives and sacrifices remind us that progress often demands facing threats far greater than mere opposition, and that the cost of change can be high but necessary. In remembering George March, Reverend Turner, and others who suffered at the hands of the Black Legion, we acknowledge not only their pain but also their strength and vision. Their stories enrich our understanding of a dark chapter in history and underscore the need to confront hatred wherever it hides. They remind us that behind every statistic of violence and terror are real people, leaders, organizers, families who dared to dream of a better, more just world. This narrative calls us to honor their legacy by continuing to expose and challenge the forces of hate, ensuring that the silence imposed by fear is broken by voices of courage and justice. It is through their stories that we find the strength to resist and the hope to build communities where such terror can never take root again. In the dark and turbulent era of the 1920s and 1930s, the Black Legion's sinister grip extended far beyond the shadowed streets and quiet homes where their terror unfolded. It penetrated the very institutions meant to protect and serve the people. Law enforcement agencies and local governments, which should have been bastions of justice and order, were often infiltrated by members of this secretive organization, turning these institutions into instruments that shielded the Black Legion from accountability and justice. This infiltration created a web of complicity, so tangled that victims of the Legion's violence found themselves trapped in a system rigged against them. Their pleas for help ignored, dismissed, or actively obstructed. The presence of Black Legion members within police forces was not merely incidental. It was a deliberate strategy that allowed the organization to operate with a frightening level of impunity. Officers who were sworn to uphold the law wore two faces by day, figures of authority in uniform. By night, hooded enforcers of racial terror. This duality meant that crimes committed by the Legion were often covered up. Investigations stalled, and evidence destroyed. Victims who dared to report assaults, kidnappings, or arson were frequently met with indifference or hostility, leaving them vulnerable and isolated. In some cases, police officers actively participated in the intimidation and violence, wielding their badges as tools of oppression rather than protection. This collusion extended beyond the police to local government officials who were either members or sympathizers of the Black Legion. Politicians and bureaucrats used their positions to influence policies and decisions that favored the Legion's white supremacist agenda, ensuring that laws and enforcement practices marginalized black communities. Immigrants, labor activists, and anyone opposing the status quo. These officials often obstructed efforts to investigate or prosecute Legion members, turning a blind eye to the widespread abuse and terror the group inflicted. The very systems designed to provide justice and equity became barriers that perpetuated fear and violence. One chilling consequence of this infiltration was the systematic dismissal of crimes against Black Americans and other targeted groups as random acts of violence or personal disputes. When Black homes were burned or activists disappeared, local authorities frequently refused to pursue investigations, leaving communities to suffer in silence. Fire departments arrived too late or not at all, and cases of arson were left unresolved. This negligence was not accidental, but a reflection of the deep-rooted bias and influence the Black Legion wielded within these institutions. The message was clear: justice was reserved for some, while others were left to endure terror without recourse. The infiltration of law enforcement also created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust within communities. Knowing that officers could be members of the Black Legion, or at least sympathetic to their cause, meant that many victims chose not to report crimes, fearing retaliation or further victimization. The very people who should have been their protectors were part of the problem, eroding confidence in the justice system and deepening social divisions. This breakdown of trust reinforced the Black Legion's power, allowing them to continue their reign of terror with minimal opposition. This complicity extended to the courtroom as well, where judges and prosecutors with ties to the Black Legion could influence legal outcomes. Trials, if they occurred at all, were often biased, and members frequently escaped punishment. The legal system, rather than serving as a check on extremist violence, was compromised by those who shared the Legion's ideology or benefited from its existence. This systemic failure further marginalized victims and emboldened the organization to expand its reach. The intertwining of the Black Legion with official institutions also allowed the group to maintain a facade of legitimacy. By embedding themselves in positions of authority, members could manipulate public perception and stifle dissent. They could frame their actions as patriotic defense, masking their true intent under the guise of protecting American values. This duality made it incredibly difficult for outsiders to understand the full extent of the Legion's terror, as the visible face of law and order concealed a shadow army operating behind the scenes. Despite these formidable barriers, pockets of resistance emerged as brave individuals and communities refused to be silenced. Black newspapers began to expose suspected members and document the Legion's activities, challenging the cover-up and demanding accountability. However, these efforts were met with fierce backlash, including bombings and arson attacks on Black-owned media outlets, further highlighting the lengths to which the Black Legion would go to suppress truth and maintain control. The complicity of law enforcement and local governments in obstructing justice not only prolonged the Black Legion's campaign of terror, but also left lasting scars on the communities they targeted. The erosion of trust in public institutions created cycles of fear and marginalization that persisted long after the group's decline. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a society where power could be co-opted by hate, and justice denied to those who needed it most. Understanding this dark chapter reveals the critical importance of vigilance in safeguarding institutions from infiltration and bias. The Black Legion's ability to embed itself within systems of power serves as a cautionary tale about how extremist groups can manipulate structures meant to protect democracy and human rights. It reminds us that true justice requires transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to equality under the law. Reflecting on this, his history challenges us to recognize the signs of institutional complicity and to support reforms that prevent the corruption of justice by hatred and prejudice. The story of the Black Legion's infiltration is a stark reminder that the fight against terror and oppression extends beyond confronting overt violence. It demands rooting out the hidden networks that enable such violence to thrive. As we look back on the impact of the Black Legion, we see how deeply fear and power can intertwine to undermine the very foundations of society. The organization's success in obstructing justice through infiltration shows us the devastating consequences when those entrusted with protecting the public instead shield those who seek to harm it. Their legacy compels us to remain vigilant, to stand with those seeking justice, and to build institutions that serve and protect all members of our communities without fear or favor. In the early months of 1936, a single event shattered the cloak of invisibility that the Black Legion had so carefully maintained for over a decade. The brutal murder of Charles, a working-class white man with connections that reached beyond his local community, ignited a chain reaction that would ultimately expose one of the most secretive and violent white supremacist groups in American history. Until that moment, the Black Legion had operated largely in the shadows, their crimes masked by fear, silence, and systemic complicity within law enforcement and government. But the killing of Charles P. forced the nation to confront the harsh reality of a terror organization that had embedded itself deeply within the fabric of society. Charles P.'s murder was no random act of violence. It was a calculated execution meant to serve as a warning to those who might oppose the Legion's agenda. On a fateful night, Charles was forcibly dragged from his home by a group of armed, hooded men. His wife and children witnessed the horror, powerless to intervene as the men threw him into a waiting vehicle and vanished into the night. When his body was found days later in a shallow grave outside the city, the evidence of torture and brutality was undeniable. His skull fractured, his hands bound tightly with barbed wire. The gruesome nature of the crime sent shockwaves not only through the local community, but also across the broader Midwest region, where the Black Legion had been quietly spreading their influence. What made Charles P.'s case particularly significant was who he was: not a vulnerable black activist or labor organizer, but a white man with ties to working-class networks and local politics. His murder could not be dismissed as the random racial violence that the Legion had used to terrorize marginalized communities with little consequence. This time, law enforcement officials were compelled to act, sparking an investigation that peeled back the layers of secrecy that had shielded the Black Legion for years. Detectives and prosecutors, armed with new resolve and public pressure, pursued the case with unprecedented rigor. The investigation quickly uncovered a network of hidden bunkers, weapons caches, and membership rosters that mapped out the structure of the Black Legion like a military organization. Witness testimony and informant confessions began to unravel the group's clandestine operations. One of the most damning revelations came from Dayton Dean, a notorious enforcer within the Legion, whose detailed confession exposed the chain of command, the secret rituals, and the systematic violence that had been executed with chilling efficiency. Dean's testimony transformed the investigation from a local murder case into a nationwide crackdown. Law enforcement agencies coordinated raids across multiple states: Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, targeting secret meeting places and arresting dozens of members, including police officers, politicians, and businessmen. The evidence gathered was overwhelming, revealing a terror network that had not only committed murders but also manipulated political systems and law enforcement to protect their violent agenda. The public reaction to the revelations was one of shock and outrage. Newspapers ran exposes that unveiled the Legion's reach and the complicity of those who had enabled its operations. Communities that had lived in fear now saw the true scale of the threat they faced, and calls for justice grew louder. The exposure of the Black Legion became a pivotal moment in American history, highlighting how deeply extremist groups could infiltrate society and operate under the guise of patriotism and protection. This exposure also spurred a broader conversation about the nature of domestic terrorism and the challenges of confronting hate groups that operate covertly. Unlike more visible organizations that relied on public demonstrations and parades, the Black Legion had perfected the art of silent terror, striking swiftly and disappearing into the shadows. The difficulty in combating such groups was underscored by the decades-long silence and complicity that allowed the Legion to grow unchecked. The trial that followed the arrest of Charles P.'s killers was a media spectacle and a turning point. It laid bare the inner workings of the Black Legion, revealing not only the crimes but also the culture of fear and loyalty that bound its members. Witnesses testified about the oath recruits swore, pledging their lives to the cause and the brutal consequences for betrayal. Survivors recounted horrific nights of abduction and violence, painting a stark picture of the terror inflicted on countless communities. Though the trial resulted in convictions and a significant blow to the organization, it also exposed the difficulty of dismantling deeply embedded hate networks. Many members avoided prosecution due to lack of evidence or the protection afforded by their positions in society. The Black Legion's ideology, while battered, persisted beyond the courtroom, adapting and resurfacing in new forms in the decades to come. The murder of Charles P. and the subsequent investigation serve as a powerful reminder of how a single event can pierce through the veil of secrecy and fear that allows hate to thrive. It underscores the importance of vigilance, community courage, and the role of an accountable justice system in confronting domestic terror. The exposure of the Black Legion was not just a legal victory, but a societal reckoning, one that forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and the limits of justice. This chapter in history, while dark, offers crucial lessons for today. It challenges us to recognize the signs of covert extremism, the dangers of institutional complicity, and the vital need to protect democratic institutions from being co-opted by hate. The story of Charles P.'s murder and the fall of the Black Legion continues to resonate, reminding us that the fight against injustice requires unrelenting courage and collective action. By peeling back the layers of this hidden terror, we honor those who suffered in silence and those who dared to bring the truth to light. The legacy of this exposure endures as a call to action, urging society to remain vigilant, to stand against hate in all its forms, and to ensure that the shadows no longer hide those who seek to harm. The wave of arrests and confessions that followed the murder of Charles P. unleashed a storm of legal action and media scrutiny that would ultimately bring the Black Legion's dark empire crashing down. Once cloaked in secrecy and fear, the organization found itself thrust into the harsh spotlight of public judgment, its carefully guarded facade shattered by the relentless pursuit of justice. The trials that ensued not only exposed the horrific extent of the Legion's crimes but also ignited a national conversation about the insidious nature of hate and the urgent need to confront it head-on. As courtroom doors opened and witnesses took the stand, the nation was offered a rare glimpse into the inner workings of an organization that had operated like a ghost army for years. Testimonies from former members, some of whom chose to break their oath of silence in exchange for leniency, painted a chilling picture of the Legion's militant hierarchy, secret initiation rituals, and systematic campaigns of terror. These accounts revealed a group not driven by mere prejudice but by a ruthless, coordinated effort to wield power through violence and intimidation, targeting Black Americans, immigrants, labor activists, and anyone daring to oppose their twisted vision of America. The trials were more than legal proceedings. They became a reckoning, They forced communities across the Midwest to confront the reality that terror had been lurking in plain sight, sometimes even behind the badges of those sworn to protect them. Prosecutors laid bare evidence of the Legion's infiltration into police forces, local governments, and businesses, demonstrating how their influence had allowed crimes to go unpunished and dissent to be crushed. Photographs of black hooded figures, weapons caches, and membership rosters were displayed in courtrooms, transforming abstract fears into undeniable proof. The media coverage amplified this reckoning, turning the Black Legion into a household name synonymous with hate and violence. Newspapers across the country published in-depth exposes, revealing not only the details of the crimes, but also the shocking level of institutional complicity that had enabled the Legion's rise. Editorials decried the organization's violent acts and the betrayal of public trust by officials involved. The public's response was swift and decisive. Outrage spread, sparking protests and calls for sweeping reforms to root out extremist influence from public institutions. The cultural impact was immediate and profound. Hollywood, sensing the weight of the story, produced films that, while fictionalized, captured the essence of the Black Legion's terror and the broader struggle against racial hatred. These portrayals served both as warnings and memorials, ensuring that the lessons of this dark chapter would not be forgotten. The story of the Black Legion became a symbol of the dangers posed by secret hate groups and the imperative of vigilance in protecting democracy and human rights. In the courtroom, verdicts sent a clear message. No organization, no matter how deeply entrenched or secretive, could operate above the law indefinitely. Key leaders were convicted, receiving sentences that underscored the seriousness of their crimes. These legal victories provided a measure of justice for the countless victims whose lives had been shattered. However, dismantling the Black Legion's extensive network proved challenging, as many members managed to evade prosecution due to lack of evidence or the protective shields of their social standing. Yet, the organization's public condemnation marked a turning point that significantly curtailed its operations and influence. Despite the victory, the trials revealed the persistent shadows of systemic racism and the ease with which extremist groups could exploit economic anxieties and social divisions. The Black Legion's ability to infiltrate legitimate institutions served as a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities within society's structures. It highlighted the necessity for ongoing vigilance, transparency, and accountability to prevent similar groups from gaining footholds in the future. The downfall of the Black Legion was not just the defeat of a hate group, but a pivotal moment in America's ongoing struggle with racial and social justice. It demonstrated the power of truth, courage, and collective action to dismantle forces that thrive on fear and division. The trials galvanized activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens to challenge discrimination and advocate for policies that promote inclusion and equality. The legacy of the Black Legion's exposure resonates beyond the courtroom and headlines. It reminds us that the fight against hate is complex and often hidden beneath layers of silence and complicity. The courage of those who spoke out, the persistence of investigators, and the outrage of the public combined to tear down a once invisible terror network. Their efforts illuminate a path forward, one that requires continued commitment to justice, education, and empathy. Reflecting on this chapter invites us to remember that extremism can take many forms, and that the defense of democracy is an active, ongoing responsibility. The story of the Black Legion's trials teaches us that justice may be delayed, but is ultimately achievable when society unites against oppression. It challenges us to listen to the voices of victims, support survivors, and hold those in power accountable, ensuring that history's darkest chapters do not repeat. Through the lens of the Black Legion's downfall, we see how the unmasking of hidden terror can serve as a catalyst for societal change. It underscores the crucial role that media, the judiciary, and public engagement play in shining light on injustice. This story, painful yet empowering, stands as a testament to the resilience of communities and the enduring human spirit's capacity to confront hatred with hope and action. As we close this chapter, the lessons remain clear. Hate thrives in darkness and silence. But exposure, justice, and collective resolve can overcome even the most entrenched forces of terror. The Black Legion's legacy warns us to remain vigilant, to challenge hate wherever it hides, and to build a society where fear no longer rules in the shadows, but where justice and equality shine brightly for all. The story of the Black Legion may belong to a distant chapter of American history, but its echoes still reverberate through time, reminding us that the fight against hatred and intolerance is never truly finished. Though the organization was dismantled through courageous investigations, relentless legal battles, and the bravery of those who dared to speak out, the racist ideology and violent tactics it embodied did not simply vanish with its fall. Instead, they seeded themselves into future white supremacist groups, evolving and adapting to new social and political landscapes, perpetuating cycles of fear and division. This painful legacy serves as both a warning and a call to action, a historical lesson we must heed if we are to build a more just and equitable society. The Black Legion's influence stretched far beyond its active years in the 1920s and 1930s. Its secretive operations, infiltration into institutions, and use of terror tactics became a blueprint for other hate groups that followed. The way the Legion exploited economic anxieties and social tensions during the Great Depression reveals a pattern still relevant today. As extremist movements continue to manipulate fear and uncertainty to gain followers and power, understanding this history equips us to recognize the signs early and confront them with knowledge, compassion, and resilience. As we reflect on this dark chapter, it is crucial to remember the victims, the individuals and communities who lived in constant fear, who suffered brutal violence, and who fought tirelessly for justice and dignity. Their stories are a testament to human courage in the face of oppression and a reminder that silence and complacency only serve to empower hate. It is through acknowledging their pain and honoring their legacy that we find strength to oppose discrimination and violence in all its forms. Today, the dismantling of the Black Legion stands as a beacon of hope and a proof that justice can prevail, even against deeply entrenched hate. Yet it also challenges us to remain vigilant, to ensure that extremist ideologies do not gain ground under new guises, and that the institutions meant to protect all citizens are not compromised. Education, community engagement, and unwavering commitment to equality are essential tools in this ongoing battle. Thank you for joining me in uncovering the story of the Black Legion, a story many have tried to forget, but one we must remember. If you found this video insightful and important, please like, subscribe, and share it to help spread awareness and encourage dialogue about these critical issues. Together, we can keep the lessons of history alive and work towards a future free from the shadows of hatred.